So what we're going to do today is we're going to help you select the right system. So we're going to look at a lot of variations, but they're all within this bin pile variety. And then once I help you select the right one for you, then I'll also give you some tricks on how to make it work better. I think it's really important to understand that there is no best composting method. They all work. Some are faster, some are slower. There are different pros and cons, and we're going to have a look at those. But I think what's really important is that people select something that matches their own situation. So it's a matter of getting that right. And if you do that, then you'll continue doing it. So what is the right system? So here are some considerations. So we're going to go through a number of points here, and you can sort of think for yourself, well, how does this apply to me? And that will kind of narrow things down for you. Space is, of course, important. We now have smaller homes, smaller backyards, and some of these composting methods just take more space than others. Some take no space at all. And at the opposite end, we have these three bins sitting here, and that's probably the system that takes the most space. And it is the traditional system, and it's the system that works best for hot composting, but it does take a lot of space if you have a normal sized backyard. Now, you don't need 3 bins. You can get away with 1 bin. 2 is even better. 3 is maybe not needed, but really nice for a larger property. The other thing is time. It's important that you sit down and figure out, how much time do I have to actually manage this process? Do I want to do composting and put in as little effort as possible? Is this something that really interests me, and I'm going to sit down and really make it work and do it best way I can to make really fast compost? That's important. Each method takes a different amount of time. The one thing to keep in mind is that no matter which of these methods you pick, you do end up making compost. The end result is exactly the same no matter which of these methods you use. Also important is, how much material do you have? The traditional backyard doesn't actually have that much material. You have kitchen scraps that come from inside. You have plant trimmings from outside. You might have grass clippings if you collect your grass. I actually recommend you don't do that. Just leave the grass clippings right on the lawn, because the lawn needs the extra fertilizer anyways, and so why do work picking it up? But if you want to add that can produce a fair amount of material. But how much material do you have? If you're going to create big bins and you don't have very much material, then you're not going to be able to use the big bins. You're not going to take advantage of those. So how much green compostable material do you have? Or are you willing to go out and get more? So you're going to go out and get a truckload of manure and bring that to your property, or old hay and straw. I know gardeners who drive around the neighborhood in the fall picking up those paper bags that people put out to the street, and they're full of brown leaves, and they literally bring them home to their backyard, and now they have lots of compostable material. Other people are giving this stuff away, and gardeners bring it home to their property. Timing is also important. When is this material ready? If you're going to create small amounts throughout the year, then these big bins don't really work very well. So kitchen scraps, typically you have, every 2 or 3 days, you're going to take them outside. Some people might do this every day, and what we do now is we keep a little bin inside the fridge, and until that's full, we don't take it outside, so we don't have to go out very often. If you do that, then only some of the systems are going to work for you. In a traditional garden, you don't really have much material most of the year. You might have some early in the spring, because you're going to go out and you're going to clean up your garden, you're going to trim things back, you might pick up old flower stems and so on. So you have a bit of material then, and then you have pretty much nothing until fall. And then there's this glut of material in the fall. That's when most of the leaves fall. That's when you clean up your vegetable garden, and you have material there. And you go around your garden and you trim things back and rake things and so on. So you have a lot of material in the fall. When are you going to actually have that material? And that again is important. If you're going to get little bits all the way along, you better pick a system that allows you to add small amounts as you go. If you're doing the big hot composting bins, those have to kind of be built all at one time. So that means you now have to store material until you have enough of it and then put it together and start composting. For many people, that's not as convenient because now you need even more space to store all this stuff. Remember, you have to get these browns and greens right, and we'll talk again about that tonight. So you might have to store all your browns until you get enough greens, or you've got too much greens and you don't have enough browns and you have to store it until you have the right ratio. How dedicated are you going to be to this process? When I was younger, I spent a little more time and I tried doing correct composting. As I got older, I decided it wasn't really worth my time and I wanted to do less and less, and I was less dedicated to it. A lot of people screen their compost, is what this fellow's doing here. So he actually built a screen. He's shaking this and he's getting just the fine material out of it. And any pieces that are still too large, they go back in the compost pile and continue composting. Actually, I see a lot of people doing this, but it really isn't necessary. You can take all of that and just spread it around. But if this is something you're doing, then you may want to have a hotter compost system because you want to make as much fine material as possible. I find this kind of funny. These rodents and animals, so we have skunks and squirrels and rats and mice and raccoons. Some people don't care about them, and other people see this as the biggest negative of composting. I don't want these animals in my yard. I don't want them coming eating the stuff I put in my compost pile. So if that's you, you want to pick a system that keeps them out. Now, I don't think a compost pile will attract these rodent or these animals from the neighborhood. They're not all coming to your yard and living there because you have a compost pile. A lot of these animals, particularly the larger ones, raccoons and skunks, they have a routine and they just wander the neighborhood every night and they have their favorite places to eat, but they're not going to start living in your backyard because you have some food for them. So I don't think that's a big concern. Mice are in the garden anyways, and a lot of people don't see the mice, but they're there. Rats may or may not be in your garden. Squirrels too are always there. So how important are the rodents to you? Do you really care about this? Do you really want to keep these out of your garden? Then pick one of the composting systems that are rodent proof. So here we are back at the main system. This is the traditional 3-bin system. And the reason we have 3 bins is that they're used at different times of the year. So you typically have one bin that's used for collecting material. You have a second bin where you actually make the compost pile, and there's an actual process you go through to do that. And then the third bin is the finished compost, or compost that's almost finished, and so you're letting that cure mature until it's ready to use. And then you empty that out, and then that usually becomes your next collection bin, and then you move around and cycle through the others. Although you have 3 bins, each bin actually goes through the whole process. You don't move it so much back and forth. One of the things that's very handy with these bins is to actually turn the compost and mix the compost up. And a lot of people like having 2 bins because then I can use one bin to make the compost, and when I need to turn it, I turn it into an empty bin and mix it and turn it as I'm doing that. If I only have one of these bins, it's really hard to mix it. I kind of have to take it all out, put it on the lawn in front, and then mix it up and put it back in again. And that's another reason for the extra bin. I think 2 bins works quite well. If you have the space for 3, that's nice to have, but 2 works really well. So here's some pros and cons for these traditional bins. This is really the only way you're going to do really good hot composting. The other systems might heat up a little bit, but every other system I'm going to describe, it won't really get you to the hot composting stage. So if that's your goal, then you need to use these bins. It's the only way it'll work. Now there's lots of claims that some of these other things work, but they don't. They will make compost, but they won't do the hot composting process. Now, why do you care if it's hot composted? Well, hot composting has a couple benefits. It's faster than cold composting. So if I get the temperature high enough, I will make compost faster. Once the temperature gets high, I also tend to kill weed seeds, and I kill a lot of the pathogen. So we want that temperature nice and high, and all of these other things that we don't want in the compost tend to die off. So weed seeds are typically killed quite easily. Pathogens may or may not be killed, but you almost always reduce the amount of pathogens in that compost pile. And that's the reason most people use the hot composting. That and speed. Now, the downsides of hot composting is that you have to work much harder at it. So you have to keep turning the material, you have to make sure the moisture levels are right, you have to get enough air in there, and so on. And so this process, if you're going to do hot composting, is more work. The other pro, and it's really a con as well, is that it makes more compost, a larger volume, but you need more materials to go into it. So if you have a smaller yard and you're not going to have a lot of material, there's no sense building big bins because it won't get hot. This bin has to be at least 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, 4 feet deep, and you need enough material to get the temperature up. Make exactly the same system and make it smaller, it won't get really hot. That's both an advantage and a disadvantage depending on how much material you have. The cons for this is that they take up a fair amount of space. And in my first garden, I put together 3 nice bins and I had a larger yard and it worked really nice. In my second garden, I had a much smaller backyard and they just didn't fit. So I stopped doing that kind of composting. And in fact, there I only built 1 bin and it was a little on the small side because A, I didn't have the garden space to dedicate to it, and I wasn't generating enough material to compost. So I didn't have material for a big bin. The traditional bins pretty much are always home built. I'm not sure I've ever seen a commercial bin that you can go out and buy. So you also have to be a little handy, but these can be made quite easily. Or you can make them really fancy. And there's lots of videos to show you how to make these. Quite honestly, the simplest way is to get 3 skids, put them up vertically, leave the front open. So you just have 2 sides and a back, and you just have to join them in the corners. And you can do that with a bit of wire. And that's all you need. And that's the easiest way to build them. You get the skids usually for free. You have to hunt around a little bit to find them. Easy to build. As I said, other people build really complex systems, but you really can't buy these. Here's another take on that bin. So this can be made different sizes, but some people will make them the same size. So a 4 by 4 by 4 foot space. But rather than having a permanent bin, you put in 4 posts and you just stretch some wire around it. It maybe doesn't look quite so nice, but it works. It has the advantage that there's lots of air going in here. It's a little hard to turn this material because it doesn't have a front entryway. There's no doorway to it. So what you typically do is you just take the wire off completely. Then you can do your turning and mixing, and then you put the wire back again. And so that's pretty easy to do. So the wire cage, the pros of this is that construction is very easy. You don't have to worry about air movement. And we're going to talk about that a little later, but getting enough air in these piles is really important. You can do hot composting here if the pile is big enough. I mean, whether you have fencing material or you have wood doesn't really matter. When we're doing hot composting, we need the size and we need to build it the right way. The cons, it's a little harder to turn the pile, and because there's so much air in there and the sides are completely open, you do have to watch the watering a little more. In my opinion, wire cages are kind of ugly in the backyard. I guess if you can hide them somewhere behind a shed or something, that doesn't really matter. This is a solution that I haven't seen a lot in North America, but is very popular in Europe, and it is available in North America, and it's called the green cone. Now that is a brand name, and it doesn't have to be the green cone. It can be some other variations of this. But the way this works is that you have 2 main plastic containers that fit together. One gets put in the ground. So you actually dig a hole. We set the bottom part of the cone into the soil, and that's where the compostable material goes. And it fills the bottom up. And then we take the right-hand one and we put that on top. And you end up with this sort of a double cone system. Now, these things work fairly well. The pros are that it's very easy to use. You dig this hole, and when you have some material, you just push it in the top. And they typically have a lid that closes. So that keeps all the rodents out. Right? You open it up when you need it, throw some stuff in, close it again, and away you go. Because half of this is in the ground and half above, it tends not to dry out so quickly because it's getting moisture from the soil. But it does warm up because the top part is exposed to the sun. The cons are that it doesn't have a lot of space. They're relatively small. It's really difficult to turn the material, and turning is important to get higher temperatures. So this system is designed so you basically throw the stuff in on top of each other, and every time you have fresh stuff, you throw it on top of the old stuff, and it just accumulates in there. And over time it composts. So the actual composting process here is much slower. This system may not be as eco-friendly, and this is something we haven't really talked about. But when things compost, they do produce CO2. And CO2 is not a very good gas because it causes a greenhouse effect. So it warms the earth. But that's better than nitrous oxide. So if we take compostable material and we compost it without enough air, then we tend to get nitrous oxide. And that is a much worse gas for polluting the air. So it heats the earth something like 20 times more than the CO2 does. So we want to try and keep away from creating nitrous oxide. And that's one of the problems with this system. Most of the material is below ground. We can't stir it. We can't get oxygen into it. It doesn't have a lot of open sides, so air isn't flowing in as well. And because of that, we don't have enough oxygen to compost and produce CO2, so we tend to produce nitrous oxide. So that is a downside to that. Because the system is in the ground, it is warmer there than systems that are above ground. So in cold climates, they can actually work a little better. Anything above the soil is the same temperature as the air temperature, or pretty close to it. Below ground is actually quite warm. Probably know that the ground freezes. So we're in zone 5 here. The ground certainly freezes in the winter, but it doesn't get that cold. So when it freezes, it goes a few degrees below zero and then it stops. And the reason is that the center of the earth is quite hot, and there's constant heat moving from the center of the earth up to the soil surface, and then it escapes to the air. It gets lost in the air. And that heat that's traveling up the soil tends to keep the soil warm. So even though it's frozen, it's only a couple degrees below that. So these systems work much better in the early spring and particularly in the fall when the ground is still warm. And so you'll get composting longer than if this is above ground. So that is another advantage to this system. This is another type of bin, and this is probably the most common one that smaller yards will use. These are commercially available, or you can make your own. And there are lots of DIY recipes for this, both for this and that green cone. You can make those yourself. You can just get some garbage cans and put some holes in the side and get a lid and so on and build one. The way these work is the top opens up and you dump the material in and it sits above ground. So all the composting material here is above ground and it's in this chamber. And these are maybe 2.5 feet tall, 3 feet tall, something like that. So they're not super large. A lot of them will have a door on the front so that as the material composts, you can open the door and reach in and get the good stuff at the bottom. And then you keep throwing new stuff in at the top. So these things work if you have a small amount of material. They don't get super hot, but if you place them in a sunny location, they do warm up and you do compost faster in the summertime. These things are also really nice in the wintertime because you can put them near a doorway. So you can go out in winter and dump your material in here and you don't have to go to the end of the garden to dump it. And I actually use them all year long. I just open the top, throw the stuff in. In wintertime, composting stops because it's too cold, but that stuff will start composting in the spring. And in fact, the way I do this is I use it mostly for kitchen scraps, and I have brown leaves nearby. So what I'll do is I'll put in kitchen scraps for a little while, a couple of weeks maybe, and then when there's a fair amount, I take a couple handful of leaves and I throw those in. Kitchen scraps are very high in nitrogen, so that's your green, and then the brown leaves are your browns, and mixing it up gives you a nice combination. Brown leaves also tend to decrease the smell of these things, because if you have a lot of fresh kitchen scraps, particularly in July and August, they can smell a bit. But you don't really notice it unless you open the lid. Now, the one problem with this bin is that the bottom is open, right? So this is more like a cone, if you like, and the bottom's completely open. And so mice and rats can go inside. I've never seen any rats here, but we certainly had mice going inside. So what I did was I just took some chicken wire, probably actually some wire that's a little smaller than that. So it has holes that are about 1/4 inch in size. That will keep the mice out. And I put it on the bottom of the thing. So I basically closed it up with wire, and now the mice didn't get into the container. So here's your pros and cons. They're really easy to use. You don't really do any mixing. They're not really designed for mixing the material. So the composting process is a bit on the slow side. I think they look reasonably nice, particularly if you buy one. The DIY ones I've seen aren't quite so nice looking, but part of that is the color of the containers they usually use. The commercial ones are almost always black, so they kind of disappear in the garden a little bit. As I mentioned, rodents can be kept out if it's closed, if that's a problem for you. Now, the reason I did it, I had this right at the back door of our garage, and I tried to keep the mice away from the house. I didn't want them living in this thing and then running into the house whenever it got cold. They're a bit on the expensive side. You can use trash cans and make your own for a lot less. They're not going to make a lot of compost, and if you have a lot of plant material in your garden, they're really not large enough. Although, of course, you could have a couple of these going. And the compost happens very slowly. This stuff really sits in there for about a year before it compost. One of the problems with them is they have vent holes, but they're not nearly enough. So it's not getting enough oxygen in there. If you wanted to drill more holes and get more oxygen in there, then the composting will speed up a little bit. This one is very common, and this is a rotary one. So this usually has a handle on the side, and you can easily rotate this. And this particular one has 2 compartments, so the 2 doors are open there, and there's a left side and a right side. That can be very handy, because one of the downsides of all of the last couple of things I've showed you is that if you use these for kitchen scraps, you can never really have finished compost, right? You start in spring, let's say April, we start throwing stuff in here. By August, the early stuff is starting to compost, but yesterday you threw some more apple cores in there and some more kitchen scraps. And so you're constantly adding new stuff to the old stuff, so you never really get finished compost. So what they do here is they have a left and right chamber. And so you fill up the one, and then you stop adding to it and let it compost, and you fill up the second one. And then when the first one's finished, you empty it and you change the sides. So this way you can actually finish the compost. The reason they put this on a rotary system and have a handle is that mixing up compost speeds it up. And so this makes mixing quite easily. You don't need any tools, you don't have to move stuff, you just put the handle on, turn it a few times, and your mixing is done. And you come out once a week and do that. Now, I've seen the manufacturers of these things claim that you can make very quick compost, put the material in, and 2 weeks later you have compost. That's not going to happen. These things don't make hot compost, and they don't make fast compost. They're a little faster than the stationary units where you're not mixing at all, but they're not super fast. The other problem some people have is that they put in too much high nitrogen material, because these are used a lot for kitchen scraps, and the amount of nitrogen there is a bit too high. And if you do that, then what happens is the nitrogen starts smelling. the material is too wet, gets kind of mushy and wet and smelly, and you got a real mess in there. So again, it's really handy if you keep some leaves from the previous year around and you just put a handful of that in. Paper works too, because paper is high in carbon, absorbs some of that moisture. These things also don't have nearly enough vent holes, so they tend to hold moisture too long. You have to be very careful how wet you get them. But if you do it correctly, they actually work quite well. Perfectly rodent proof. They can be emptied fairly easily, so if I want to get this material out of here, I don't have to dig it out. I just turn it so the doorways are facing down, and I put a wheelbarrow under there. Rotate it so the doors are down, open the door, and the stuff pretty much falls out, and away I go. Here's a similar thing. It's a DIY. It's just a trash can with holes in it, and there's lots of these sort of designs on the internet. So we call these tumblers and rotating drums. This thing rotates, and you don't need a fancy system for that. You could just use a regular garbage can with a lid, and you attach the lid so it doesn't fall off, and then you just rotate it on the ground. You just roll it. Or you can find a bunch of DIY systems where people make little wooden platforms that either have wheels or allow you to rotate it somehow. They're pretty easy to use. They're easy to empty. Most of them, if there's a tight-fitting lid, has no rodents, so that's not a problem. But most of the time, they don't have enough vents, particularly the commercial ones. Now, if you're making it yourself, you can always drill extra holes. It's not going to make a lot of compost, and it doesn't make it really fast. Keyhole gardens are popular on the internet, but I don't see a lot of people actually making them. This design actually started in Africa, where they use them for gardens, and I think this is a design that more people should use. This is built up, so it's reasonably high, and you don't need to do that. This thing could be 1 brick high, or in fact it could be almost at ground level. It could be made out of all kinds of different materials. So if you prefer wood, you could make it out of wood. The idea here is that we have a garden, and in the center we have this chimney, if you like, this open area where there's no soil, and we simply throw in our compostable material into that chimney. And the idea is that it fills up with the stuff at the bottom, compost. If it's cool, and because of the volume here, it's always going to be cool. You're not going to get hot composting. The earthworms will come in from the side, from the soil, and they help digest that material. The nutrients will run back into the garden. So you have a composting system that takes almost no effort to make the compost, and it automatically feeds the plants that are growing around it. But you have to build the garden in the first place, so there is work for that. But once it's built, the actual processing is very easy. Now, I'm not convinced that a lot of these nutrients are going to go running out into the garden space. I think that's exaggerated. What's going to happen is that you have this center cylinder, and as the stuff decomposes, the nutrients will be released, and they're mostly going to run down, not into the root system. So that's one disadvantage of this garden. So pros and cons. It's really easy to make compost here. It needs a little space, but of course you have to have the garden around it. But you're going to have gardens anyway, so we don't count the garden space here. I don't know how efficient it is, but it's an interesting idea. All right, so now we want something really simple. You can do trench composting. And in fact, when I first started gardening, which is quite a few years ago now, this is what I did. So I built myself a vegetable garden, and I took the pathways, and I would just dig a hole in the pathways, and I would throw in my kitchen scraps, and then when it got full, I would cover them up. And then I would dig another little trench beside that. So I was basically walking almost on my compost pile all the time. This is really easy. You dig a hole, throw the stuff in, cover it up when you have enough, and dig a hole somewhere else and start all over again. Turning, no worrying about it. And you don't get compost here, though. That's one advantage. It's in the soil, but it is building soil in the garden. And so this is a really easy way to do that. These little space. This could be pathways, or it could be right in the garden itself. It could be right next to plants that you want to do. But we have this problem that there's no oxygen getting in there, or very little. And so it's going to produce more nitrous oxide. And although it's fairly efficient in getting rid of this organic matter, it's probably producing nitrous gases, which are adding to our global warming problem. And at the end of it, of course, you don't have compost to move somewhere else in the garden. This is the method that I use most now, which is the really lazy man's method. I do almost all my cleanup in the spring, and I go through, and anything that's laying on the ground stays there. Anything that's sticking up gets cut down. And so if I have a hostas stem up, it's 3-4 feet tall, I just cut it into sort of 6-inch lengths. And I actually use head shears for that. It's really fast for chopping this up. And I just let it drop on the ground. Wherever it falls, that's where it is. And so this time of the year, the garden's not the neatest garden in the neighborhood because you've got all these old stems and leaves laying around, but it's not bad looking. Plants grow up around it. The organic matter is sitting on the ground behind these plants. Nature comes along and decomposes it. I don't have to turn it. I don't have to do anything to it. I don't have to carry it around. It just composts. The problem with this method is it works really great for garden plant material. It's not quite so neat if you're going to throw your kitchen scraps out of here. Right, so you've got your old banana peel and you throw it in the middle of your garden, it's gonna look kind of ugly. So that's why I tend to take my kitchen scraps and put them in one of these plastic barrel systems. But all the yard stuff I leave in the garden itself. And we call this the cut and drop method. When you're coming out here in the middle of summer and you're deadheading and so on, again, cut it, drop it. Wherever you are, just leave it right there and everything stays in the garden. So no costs, nothing to build, nothing to buy, and requires no space at all. Aesthetics, well, that's kind of up to you. If you really like pristine, neat gardens, you're probably not going to like this system. If you can live with a bit of a messy ground for a few months, it's actually good for the garden. It's good for your insects. Things hibernate in those leaves because you've left them all winter. And so it's actually better for the environment to do it this way. So here's some composting tips. So how do we speed up composting? What makes composting happen faster? Well, one thing you can do is shred the material. So if I take a banana peel and it's large and it's whole, it takes quite a while for the microbes to come along and digest that because they have this outer skin. It's just hard to do. If I take that and chop it up, make it smaller, then I have more surface area and the microbes can act on it faster. And that's true whether these are fall leaves or refuse from the garden. If we chop up the material smaller and smaller, it will compost faster. Now, the downside, of course, is that that's more work. You need some way to shred it. You need some equipment and so on. So you have to decide, is fast compost worth it for you? Moisture level is really important too. If the compost gets too dry, it stops working. As soon as that happens, it stops composting and it slows down. On the other hand, if it's too wet, you have the opposite effect. The microbes can't work efficiently that way. So you kind of have to look at your climate and where you're working and then decide, do I have to water this once in a while? Or do I have to cover it up to keep some of the rain out because we're in a wet zone and we get lots of moisture? That compost should be moist enough that you can feel the moisture, but if you take a handful and squeeze it, you should never get more than maybe 1 drop of water out of there. So it's moist, but not so wet you can squeeze water out. And that's going to give you the fastest compost. So a lot of people will go out and check their pile, particularly if they're doing the hot composting, the 3-bin system. Check their pile every once in a while and either add some more moisture or cover it up and try to dry it out. We talked about turning this. This is really important because what happens is that you make the pile and then the microbes come in and they start digesting this and they get hot and the pile heats up, and that's actually slows down composting once it gets to a certain temperature. So what we do is we actually turn it to reduce that heat again down to a lower level. that gets the microbes working actively and they start warming it up again. And we want to keep it in a certain temperature range. Turning does that for us. The other benefit of turning is that the outside of the compost pile is going to compost much slower than the inside. And so when we turn this, we want to take the outside stuff and move it to the inside, and the inside stuff to the outside, and get that all mixed up, and that also speeds up composting. The last one on the list is warmth. So if you're living in the Guelph area, we're a zone 5 climate. It's really hard to get fast composting except in summer when it's warm. So winter, nothing happens. In spring and fall, it's slower because these microbes do want a certain amount of warmth. So one thing you can do in cold climates is actually put stuff around it to keep it warm. So if we make up a good compost pile, say in August, and we know it's going to get cold by October, you can wrap that. You can put bubble wrap around it. Some people put straw bales around it. Anything to keep the heat in will keep it warm longer and will speed up that composting process. Most people, when they build this compost pile, will put in layers of, let's call it 2 or 3 inches. So I'll put 2 or 3 inches of, say, grass clippings. Then I'll put 2 or 3 inches brown material, dead leaves. Then I'll put 2 or 3 inches of plant trimmings. And we kind of layer it like this so that there's a mixture of material. Now, the layering isn't so important. What is important is that we mix this all up. We don't want, a foot of manure and then a foot of brown leaves on top. That's not going to work very well. You've got to mix this stuff up. So the CN ratio is important. I think we talked last week about this brown and green ratios, which a lot of people talk about, but that's just an approximate way of dealing with this. It's much better to think in terms of the carbon-nitrogen ratio. And we want to get to a ratio of about 30. My book, Compost Science, has a more extensive list, and there are lists on the internet. So you can look up your material and see what the CN ratio is. Once we've mixed it all up, we want an average value of 30. And this is based on weight. It's a problem for gardeners because gardeners don't work in weights. Like when we have a pile of grass clipping, nobody goes and weighs that to see what weight we have. We work in volumes, right? A shovelful, a pail full, a wheelbarrow full if you've got lots of material. So we want to work in volumes, and you have to convert the volumes to the weights, which you can do. And the book actually goes through and shows you how to do all those calculations. I'm going to guess that for most people that's too much effort and they're not going to bother with that. So I've come up with a fairly simple way that gets us pretty close to an average of 30. So we don't worry about each individual material. We make 3 piles. The blue pile is anything that has a low CN ratio, so less than 30. So that's mostly of your manure, your kitchen scraps. That all goes into pile A, and we don't worry about the difference. We just call it one blue pile. Then we have a pile that has a CN ratio between 30 and 100, and that's higher in carbon, but not much higher than the 30. And then we have the stuff in the C pile, which is very high in carbon. And here we're going to have like wood chips go in there. I think paper products would go in there. Things that are really high in carbon. And then we mix our pile using these 3 piles. So we take 2 blue scoops for every one of the green scoop. Okay? 2 A's plus 1 B, and we throw it on our pile. And if we have a scoop of yellow, well, we take 8 scoops of blue, 1 scoop of yellow, throw it on our pile. So this is relatively easy to do. Now you might have some stuff left over, then you can leave that for later, but this will get you close to a ratio of 30. You don't have to weigh things, and you don't have to count individual items. You kind of just have these 3 categories. And this will get you pretty close and will give you good hot compost. Now, if you're not going to make hot compost, so you're using one of these other systems, it's still a good idea to think in terms of this CN ratio, right? If you're too far one way or the other, it's going to take forever to compost. All the systems I showed you, if you fill them all with wood chips, for instance, so we've got a big pile of the sea, it's going to take years to compost that stuff. Same with brown fall leaves. They sit there for 2 or 3 years in our climate before they will compost. On the other end, we have the kitchen scraps and lawn clippings, green lawn clippings. They're too high in nitrogen. Now, they rot quickly, but they smell at the same time, so that's not a good solution either. No matter which system you're doing, and even if you don't care about the hot composting, try to get somewhere close to that, right? What I'd said before is I take my kitchen scraps and a handful of leaves and I kind of mix them together. Puts me somewhere in the middle. And I don't worry about where I am in the middle, but I'm a little closer to the middle. So how important is this CN ratio? Well, it isn't. If you want hot composting, it's important and quite critical. You have to get the amounts right. If you're way outside one way or the other, then things will either compost really slowly or they'll start to smell. And if they start to smell, you almost always have too much nitrogen in there. And so you need to add some high carbon material. But that's good enough for most things. Now, there are some products you can get on the market. Quite honestly, I don't really recommend them, but I want to discuss them. So you do have things like this compost starter here. And compost starters, they're really designed for new gardeners who really don't know they don't need these things. So the one type of starter has a lot of nitrogen in it. And the reason for this is that if you collect material in the fall from your garden, you have too much brown. Lots of brown leaves. Most of the dried stems from your plants, they're all browns. So you got a lot of browns, not enough greens, right? You get too much carbon, not enough nitrogen. So the solution is just throw in some more nitrogen. And that can be any kind of nitrogen. A nitrogen fertilizer, for instance. And that's really what a lot of these compost starters are. They're just nitrogen fertilizer with a fancy label. So that makes sense. So if you have a lot of browns and you just can't find enough greens in the fall, just throw in some nitrogen and that will start the system up. The other thing that's critical here is that we have microbes, and the bacteria are the critical ones here. We have to have enough bacteria to make this thing happen. And so people are told, well, you probably don't have enough bacteria, so go out and buy some. And if you look at the top of this package, it said contains biological compost inoculant. They're really saying is this has bacteria in it. Well, I have news for you. Bacteria are everywhere. Every piece of stuff you put in your compost pile is covered in bacteria. Your hands are covered in bacteria. You don't have to add any more. If you really don't believe me, then take a handful of soil, which is full of bacteria and fungi, and sprinkle that into your compost pile. Don't buy these products. Coffee grounds, very popular. They have an NPK of 1.5, 0.1, 0.2. So they do have a little more nitrogen. Not high nitrogen like a lot of people claim. CN ratio is about 23, which is a little on the low side, but they're good. They're good for your garden and they're good for a compost pile. A lot of people say these are acidic and you shouldn't use it because they're acidic. Don't worry about that. Most coffee grounds are not acidic. Here's a very controversial thing. Should you take diseased plant leaves, plant material, and put that in your compost pile? And a lot of people say no, don't put, this is a leaf with powdery mildew on it. Don't put that in your compost pile because you're just spreading that disease around. You're going to have more next year. Well, the reality is that most of the diseases in your garden are there all the time. Whether you put them in the compost pile or not, they're going to be there next year. Many of these diseases travel from all over the city to your property. They travel long distances. And in fact, on the weekend, I was speaking to another expert in this and asked him about this, and he agreed with me. He says, you might as well compost it all because you're going to have these diseases next year anyways. Don't worry about these. There may be one or two really serious diseases that you might not put in here, but for the most part, in the fall, all vegetation in the garden has some sort of disease, either fungal or bacterial. You might as well compost it and get some value out of it. Hay or straw you have to be a little careful of because there are certain herbicides that are used in making the material. And when these are eaten by animals, it actually passes through the animal and is in their manure, and the herbicide is strong enough that it can harm your plants. So whether you're using the manure from this hay or straw or the hay or straw itself, it will damage plants. If you're using this kind of material, make sure you know where it's coming from. It's not a huge problem, but there are cases every year where it does come up. What about paper? Well, for the most part, there's nothing wrong with composting paper. I would tend to stay away from colored glossy paper. Throw that in the garbage. But anything that's not glossy, any black and white, so your newsprint and most other papers are fine. Those are vegetable dyes. There's nothing wrong with composting it. The reality though is paper has very high carbon levels and compost very slowly. So yes, you can compost it, but you may want to leave it out just because it's so slow in compost. Lots of talk about toxic plants. So people say don't compost your rhubarb leaves because they're toxic. That is actually a complete myth. The leaves aren't any more toxic than the stems, and we eat the stems. Monkshood is also a toxic plant. Again, for the most part, this isn't a concern. All those plants have toxic chemicals in them. You put them in your compost pile, the microbes will decompose a lot of those compounds, and then it's going to be months before it ever gets in the soil, and it's not going to bother your plants. So I don't know of any toxic plants that I would be concerned about. Wood ash, the problem with wood ash is it has a high pH, so it's about a 10.5. It does have some potassium in it, but around here our pH already is like 7.4, which is on the high side. We'd rather be about 6.5, and we're 7.5. So we don't want to add wood ashes around here. If you're living in an area with an acidic soil and you want to increase the pH, then wood ashes does make some sense. Does it matter if the compost pile or the container is in full sun or shade? Sort of. Again, it depends on your climate. So in cold climates like here, it's better off in a sunny location because it will warm up faster and you'll make faster compost. If you're in Florida, you probably do the opposite. You want to actually keep it cooler, so you'd put it in the shade, and then sort of halfway between it is less important. But our problem is that we can really only do good composting in the summer months that are warmer. So anything you can do to keep that compost pile warmer will speed up the process. So there are different types of pallets. So these are the wooden skids that we're using for building the walls. Some of the really cheap ones may only last you 4 or 5 years. The better ones will last 10 years. They're pretty good. The reason is that the sides tend to dry out fairly well, so the wood's not in constant contact with that compost. And they seem to last quite well. Are there good or bad types of wood to use? You know what, these are free, so you can't be too fussy. I mean, if you could get cedar ones, that would be great, but I don't think I've ever seen those. I wouldn't worry too much about them. There is a potential risk that the skids have been exposed to certain chemicals, which could be a problem. So I guess if the skid looks very stained and has a lot of crud on it, maybe not use them. Most of the skids I found have been quite clean, and I wouldn't hesitate to use them. Is it necessary to turn the material? No. Okay, so you don't have to do fast composting. This turning will speed up composting. It will get air in there and make the thing work faster. It is not necessary to do that. In fact, another very easy way to compost fall leaves is to just pile them up. Pile them up, don't add anything to it, just fall leaves. You don't put anything around them and just leave them. Now they're going to take a couple years to compost really well, but it happens. If you do absolutely nothing and you pile up organic matter, you will get compost. So everything we talked about speeding it up, we only do that because you want to get it to the point where you have compost and you can start using it. And if you have a lot of organic material, you want to speed it up so you don't use quite so much space. But it isn't necessary to do any of that. If you take a banana peel and throw it on the ground, it will compost, right? No matter what you do. It's just going to be slower.